Darkly-Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema, exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly-splendid abodes. The Chaldean Oracles of Zoroaster, as collated by Wynn Westcott, are a highly influential and yet fairly obscure set of pithy phrases. These oracles seem to hint at an entire schema for the cosmos. We'll dip our wings into the darkly-splendid waters of these oracles, perchance to glimpse the light of the fire therein. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
I don't know if we're actually prepared for this, but we are looking at...
I never know if I'm prepared for these.
Yeah, exactly. We're looking at the Oracles of Zoroaster. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
The Chaldean Oracles of Zoroaster.
Yeah.
And Zoroaster being...
Dubiously of Zoroaster.
Yeah.
I think this is about, what is it, like 3rd or 4th century? Is that what we think it is?
You know what? It's actually various centuries. I was looking up. This morning. I was kind of going over the different attributions, like these different phrases attributed to different writers with Greek names. Most of them are from like Constantinople, or that were connected with it in some way. So a few of them that are connected with Alexandria and that sort of thing.
Oh, the citations that Westcott gives.
So these little verses are all kind of taken from different writings by all these different writers who seem to have been, from what I can gather, all Neoplatonists.
I think what's going on is that there is a lost work called the Chaldean Oracles that is from a roughly single source, maybe, and that person's name is like Julian the Chaldean or something like that, something with a J. But because it's lost, we have to kind of guess what it's about, and so the citations in here are from, you're right, Neoplatonic authors who were influenced by the oracles, who have quotations from the oracles in their work. So that's why it seems like they're drawn from various places, but it's like various places that quoted one original text is the idea.
Mm-hmm. And it's questionable to me if it's actually one original text, because it has to be said that we tend to fall into this idea that there's usually a Bible of a given religion. Right. So that's a consideration. With Zoroastrianism, I'll get that word right. It's actually, that's the Greek name, incidentally, of Zarathustra.
Right.
So it's a Persian sort of religion or combination of ideas that goes back, apparently, like, a long time.
So the latest date I've heard for Zoroaster is something like 500 or 600 BC, contemporary with Herodotus. That's Jason Raza Giorgiani who puts him there, and he's a contemporary philosopher who has a lot of really wacky ideas about Persian history. Like he's a real interesting wingnut. But more traditionally, because of the language that the Gathas were written in, that's the actual Zarathustra writings. Zarathustra is thought to be more like 2,000 years before Christ, or something like this.
Yeah.
Whereas the Chaldean oracles we think sort of late 2nd, early 3rd century, and not exactly in the same territory nobody thinks that Zarathustra wrote these except for Westcott, as far as I can see. He says that he gets this from some tradition, but that it's a dubious tradition, and there were 14 people named Zarathustra, and maybe that was even a generic term for all magi. And I don't know where he's getting. Maybe I have no way to evaluate these claims, but they're all, as far as I'm concerned, he's the originator. So for him to say, "Oh, there's this tradition," he's trying to found a tradition. I don't think that this has anything to do with Zarathustra.
It's fairly convenient as well that if this was all you knew about Zoroastrianism, what's the actual? Yeah, is that what we think of it as? I guess that's the term. Trying to think if there was another actual term for it.
You're getting a little bit. I think there's a few early Persian religions that are maybe getting mixed up in your mind. Like there's Mithraism around the same time, and Mithras is mentioned in this text as well. But I think the tradition that Zoroaster is thought to have founded, I think we call it Zoroastrianism. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't sound like just, I was just mentioning how I was watching a video talking about the subject just to get, just for interest's sake. And it's like, I know so little about this whole field, but it sounds, when you start learning about it, there's so much difference between what we're reading in this text and what you'll find out about the subject when you're looking into academic studies on it and that sort of thing. Like, for instance, there's no mention in here about Ahura Mazda, which is like the equivalent deity, the one sort of monadic god or whatnot that's related to this text. Although, from what this thing that I was watching was talking about, it was sort of saying that this is probably or possibly one of the first monadic religion that started up. So the first religion with one god, and it had a lot of influence and interplay with these different, the Judeo-Christian religions and whatnot.
So I think these oracles are the text we're dealing with today is, I think this is pretty firmly early Christian Gnosticism, or not early Gnosticism, like late Gnosticism, but I'm thinking of it as being early in the history of Christianity. And the Gnostics are influenced by Zoroastrianism, and one of the similarities between the two groups is this idea of an evil creator, right? Ahura Mazda is God, but Angromanu is the creator of the universe. Just like in this book, they call him Zaboath. Zaboath is God, but the creator of humanity, the creator of the earth, is some other deity. We were saying recently, usually called Yaldabaoth in here because it's called Demiurgos, but it's more. This picture in here is more complicated because it's not just Demiurgos, the demiurge creating the universe without the knowledge of God. There's all these different layers of emanation that seem to and there are layers of emanation in Gnosticism, but usually it's one of these outer layers where the demiurge or Yaldabaoth lives where some something goes awry, like with the Pistis Sophia, where there's this problem of inappropriately assigned aspiration and these sort of lower emanations conspiring together to sort of prevent souls from coming into creation, and so that they would, and then somehow that's like the creative act is the result of some sort of mischief, whereas here in this book, there's something that's called the fire that goes straight down through all the layers of emanation and is received by the goddess Hecate, and then Hecate participates in the creation of the world. So just like Yaldabaoth is only mentioned once in the Pistis Sophia, and kind of mysteriously, the demiurge is only mentioned once in this book, and kind of mysteriously, it just says, God is called Zaboath, indicating that he is above the 7 pillars, which are the demiurgos, and then the demiurge is never mentioned again. And so it's sort of like the question of where evil enters into creation is still open. And I kind of wanted to say this book doesn't deal with that, but then there's explicit sections where it talks about evils in creation. So I think I may have missed something there. But let's try to I'm of two minds about this, right? Because on the one hand, we're reading this book by Westcott, and we want to give it the most charitable reading possible. He's borrowed his translation from some translation that was done in the 1700s, and he's assembled it in a way that makes it look like a straight narrative, even though it's fragments. And he's got this idea that it's the philosophy of Zoroaster. And I think the most charitable reading would approach it that way, because that's what he says it is, but it isn't. It's a Gnostic. It's a Gnostic text in fragment, and so I'm not sure what to do with that. Like I tried to read it as a straight narrative, and then I got mad at myself for not understanding things, forgetting that it's fragments and just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So I don't know. How did you feel about? Well,
that's the thing. It is kind of a mess. Like it's the challenge that we run into is that it is cobbled together, and it's also indirectly related to what it's connected to and that sort of thing in a few different ways. So it's complicated. So the most important context for this, as you're kind of saying, if we want to give it a charitable reading, is probably to think of it in terms of the Golden Dawn perspective, because that's really where the influence comes to Crowley and to Thelema and that sort of thing. So taking this at that time as the access into this worldview, what have you, I think is kind of like gives us some context for what's going on at that time in that framework and that sort of thing. If we want to look at it as from a more academic perspective of like what it actually is, it just gets really complicated.
Yeah, I think we should maybe go back later, in a year or more or something, and read another translation of the Chaldean Oracles that treats it as fragments and does not attribute it to Zoroaster.
Yeah.
So we can understand. I don't think we absolutely need to do that, because this isn't Westcott's translation. He has taken the English from someone else who knows how to do it, and it's quite beautiful. So I enjoyed reading it. And he cited all the sources, which is nice. I kind of imagined when we were first talking about this that this was going to be a very creative project on Westcott's behalf, that, because the text only existed in fragments and he wanted to present a complete text, that there were going to be things that he had written, or maybe things that he had dreamed, or maybe things from the Gathas or it's called the Zend Avesta, which is the Zoroastrian, big book, and that he was going to have built this poem of kind of his own invention, based on what survived of the Chaldean Oracles, and that turns out not to have been what happened. The reason this is not taken seriously is not because it's a wholly creative work just invented by Westcott. It's because it's just someone else's translation reformatted to look like a straight narrative, an attempt to present it as being the full text of the Chaldean Oracles, and in some places it does make sense, and it's kind of okay to categorize these things by subject, but then to pretend that this is the recovered Chaldean Oracles, when we have no idea what percentage of the original it actually is. That's why it's sort of seen as a silly project, maybe. Yeah,
and I mean, Westcott's also framing it in comparison to the Kabbalistic layout of the four worlds and that sort of thing, which is really interesting and really brings some interesting results out of it and that sort of thing. But that's a reinterpretation and an interpolation, I guess. It's not. It again is kind of like, okay, we have to look at this from the perspective, I think, of the Golden Dawn. having this as their in for this subject, because it's already been translated from a translation from maybe some gossip or something. Mm-hmm. So it's already so removed from the actual source that it's a different thing.
Yes. Hey, what's it about? Do you have any idea? Did you ever develop at least that level of interpretation that you can say what you think the text is about?
Well, I mean, insofar as I can pull out of it at the moment, I've always had a little bit of trouble with this one, getting really clear on it, of course, but it does seem to be trying to give a sense of the nature of existence and the nature of, I guess you could say, creation. Although I don't know if it's as heavy-handed as creation per se. It makes it seem to me like we're looking at the nature of creation as essentially comparative to the nature of the individual consciousness in a way, so that the different parts of creation are like the different parts of consciousness. Not to say that it's exactly the same thing, but as above, so below. Maybe it's just sort of like trying to understand the way that the initial spark of the individual ends up with these sheaths built up over top of it in a similar way to the way that you could conceptualize like someone's consciousness kind of working its way out.
I was kind of getting a little bit mixed up about that too, and I'm not sure what the right answer is. And maybe your guess is correct that there is seen to be analogies in consciousness of what we think is in ontology. This is often the case in Western philosophy, right? That the epistemological thing is seen as a reflection of the ontological thing. You know, how we think is kind of what's in the world. And one of the clues one of the reasons to get hung up on that is because some of the emanations of creation are called things like intelligent and intelligible. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of thinking of this for a while as being like related to some of maybe the Hume that we did earlier, or some of the self, not self stuff that we talk about sometimes. It's like, oh, there's this way in which for several lines, it seems like they're talking about how, the intelligent does not exist without the intelligible, and the intelligible cannot subsist without the intelligent. So there's the way in which, the mind comes from what is perceived, but what is perceived is fed by the mind, or something like that. And I'm not, but then that's quite early on. They're like the second or third emanation after, probably the second and third emanation after what? Yeah,
kind of corresponding to Bria and Yetzirah.
Yeah, what happens here, like in terms of what they call the supernals, right? Like the three supernals, and then the next thing is the intelligent and the intelligible, and then it seems like humanity emerges well further down, what for the sake of convenience just right now I'll call the tree, even though there's no tree, but further out from the center of the fountain, there's all these fountains and all these fires and stuff, and it's very confusing. But yeah, it does maybe you're right. Maybe because I wonder what I always wonder what value we get from going this granular into, there has to be some like we can say, it seems to me valuable to say God is God, but God is not the creator. God, after several layers of emanation, mistakes start to creep into the system, and then some other God creates, right? So there's emanations from emanations that end up being creation, and so evil is accounted for by being so far removed from this original, open quotes, perfect, end quotes, creative spark. Like that seems to me at least have some explanatory force, like how could you have God and evil? Mm-hmm. Well, like let's also have an evil God or something. But then to go into so much granular detail about what each of these emanations is and it's hard for me to tell whether you're just doing fiction or whether there's something philosophically interesting
Yeah,
there.
I think that's the challenge with this, is that it's like inevitably you find yourself kind of trying to parse it to yourself in a way that makes sense. So it's like just your brain's pattern-making faculty is going to try to assemble it into something that you can make sense of. And that's why it's like that's what Westcott does in his introduction. He's laying it out in comparison to the Kabbalistic setup, specifically because that makes sense out of it, particularly to him, but it does actually have a nice kind of poetry to it until you get into the text, and then you realize, okay, well, it does and it doesn't. It kind of like, it's not really as cohesive as that unless you're looking for it.
Even these little like dramatis personale things that happen at the beginning of each chapter that are presented as being in text, right? The Oracles of Zoroaster, I'll call it section 1, cause period, God period, father, mind, fire, monad, dyad, triad. These are the first kind of words that appear in the text. And they're laid out kind of like on a table so that father is kind of over top of monad, and then next to that is mind and dyad, and next to that is fire and triad. And so it seems like there's this table carving these things off into discrete categories where it's like, okay, and because later it talks about the supernal triad, one feels obliged to imagine the tree of life, even though it's totally anachronistic. But let's say Kether is father, Chokmah is mind, and Binah is fire. You know, those attributions don't work in terms of how we're used to thinking of it Kabbalistically, but let's say that's what they're saying here.
Yeah.
But right away, as soon as you start reading it, like when it's describing the father, it talks about the father's thoughts being a fire that kind of radiates out. And so either this is not a technical term or that means triad, or like there's some way in which the supernals are so interrelated that you can't talk about one of them without introducing the other. It's actually more like 9 gods, right? Because monad is just one, but dyad it has to be 2, right? So it's the father, then the mind, and then the father and the mind, and then the fire, and then the father and the mind and the fire. Like there's sort of some way in which these things, in the impression one gets from reading the text is that these things are all sort of like interdependent somehow.
Yeah, and so it does seem like we're getting this preconception of Westcott's kind of imposed onto the text. And so if you're reading the text without reading the introduction or making any note of those titles and that sort of thing, then you're kind of at sea. And yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to reframe this text and use it for this kind of imaginative interplay, because I think that's kind of the best you're going to get out of it. You're not going to get anything academic in terms of understanding the original subject matter any better. So this is kind of like it functions in that way where it can sort of help you to get to some place with it. But it's, I mean, that's the difficulty of this text. It's just the trying to find cohesion and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, there is this problem of things which are sort of set up as technical terms, like fire means triad. Like, let's say that right off the hop. But then there's so many fires in the book, and the father, who is supposed to be the monad, has this fire, and then a couple levels emanated out from that. The intelligent and the intelligible, their relationship is a fire, and that goes all the way down, to what we would normally think of as being Malkuth, like all the way down to Hecate, so that she can do creation. But it's the father that puts souls and breaths, the monad that puts the soul and the the mind together and gives them to created bodies, and those things are also, I think, a fire. Mind means dyad, right? And at least we're introduced this, like, whenever we hear the mind, we think like that's going to be the dyad. It's a technical term. But then there's a second mind and a third mind, and all these different entities that are beginning to exist to contribute in somehow to this project of creation, and the technical, what should be a philosophical technical language that allows you to begin to understand what's being communicated and who all the figures are in the little drama we're reading. They're just used to mean everything.
Yeah.
So
it very much reminds me of looking at Crowley's quote-unquote translation of the Tao Te Ching. You know, we've got like a text that whose the original text, its context is largely shrouded in mystery, particularly from James Legg's point of view, who did the translation of it into English. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, you have Crowley translating James Legg's English translation with his interpretation of it. So then you're dealing with that as its own animal. You know?
Yeah. Is there anything you especially want to hit today? Are there unmissable sections?
I feel like there's an obligation to read out the ones that come up in, the subject matter, like related to the Golden Dawn stuff and therefore to the Thelemic corpus.
Sure. And for us, of course, the darkly-splendid abodes are mentioned in here.
Yeah, so why not hit that?
Stoop not down unto the darkly-splendid world, for, it's a bad news place and everything.
Please like and subscribe.
Yeah. Pseudo Zoroaster says not to come here, so like and subscribe.
You found us anyway.
So here it says, understanding the works of the Father, they avoid the shameless wing of fate. And so I thought that was an interesting contrast to the holy books, where you don't worry about your destiny. It's the joy winging. In the endless winging.
Yeah.
There's some relationship there. And then here later on, where it's suggesting magical philosophical precepts, things to follow if you're inclined to want to practice magic. It says, stoop not down unto the darkly splendid world, wherein continually lieth a faithless depth, and Hades wrapped in clouds, delighting the unintelligible images, preceptuous winding, a black ever-rolling abyss, ever espousing a body unluminous, formless, and void. Stoop not down, for a precipice lieth beneath the earth, reached by a descending ladder, which hath 7 steps, and therein is established the throne of an evil and fatal force. Stay not on the precipice with the dross of matter, for there is a place for thy image in a realm ever splendid. Evoke not the invisible image of the soul of nature. Look not upon nature, for her name is fatal. So there's this idea that, and I didn't really clue into this reading Liber 65 or any of the other holy books where this is mentioned, but the darkly splendid abodes, the darkly splendid world, it looks like here, they mean creation. And there's this the first magical precept. This section where they have the magical precepts, they say things like, don't do fortune telling, like don't worry about tracing the moon or the shapes of stars and the planets, because those, you don't understand what those things mean. Those things come from God and are for God, and they, they're not communicating what you think they're communicating. Also, don't worry about sacrificing animals and reading entrails or doing, because that's all, so they throw out all of fortune telling right away. And then it says not to look not even to look to the created world, because, well, and then they start talking about thrones of evil and deception, and how creation's name is, what is it? What does they say the creation's name is? Look not upon nature, for her name is fatal, it says. And of course, anything that's anything that exists in a sort of temporal way, and we're part of the Christian project is escaping the inevitability of death and passing and change. And so I thought this is a marked difference between what's going on here and what we find in Thelema, where some of the holy books seem to talk about indulging these things, both in winging and in and
not just going for that and doing the opposite of what this is saying, but like achieving both marriages, as it says in Liber Sati. So it's like some will attach more strongly to the high and others will attach to the low. But I say to you, achieve both marriages.
Oh yeah, they do. The stooping down is from that, isn't it? It's
it's
Liber
there
Sati.
and Liber 65.
But I was thinking about dipping my wings, specifically
that's from
in the darkly
Liber
splendid
65,
abodes.
because it is a corrupting aspect, and I think it's recognized as such. But I think in Thelema, it's not just the fact that we're indulging the senses and we're going in this, because that almost implies as if we are agreeing to the same duality of the good and the evil, and we're choosing the evil, which is very tempting to get on board with. But I think that kind of loses the whole picture. I think really what we're looking for is recognizing that nature shouldn't be shunned and kept separate and that sort of thing, but we should be integrating all of these aspects of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we get out of the holy books is this idea of volition being positive. Like any movement, any experience, any going, any kind of engaging with is seen as beneficial. And again, I think what's interesting about that is that the darkly splendid abodes, I always thought like, oh, this sounds like a mysterious place. It didn't clue into me that might mean, as it does here, sort of all of creation. that the created world is the darkly splendid world, and that we're already there.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's like reached by a descending. It says below the earth, stoop not down, for a precipice lieth beneath the earth. Reached by a descending ladder, which hath 7 steps. And the 7 steps, I don't know that this would actually apply to it, but it makes me think of the Chaldean order of the planets, and the planets being sort of like the 7 steps down into consciousness as opposed to up into the cosmos.
Yeah, that's that's good. But also, see, this is the danger of trying to collate these into a narrative.
It's inflicting something
because
on it,
the end of that section where it says nature, her name is fatal, or something like that, it's in here it's presented as being the end of that section, but it's actually a distinct fragment, which may not be in the right place, right? So maybe the darkly splendid world is not all of creation. Maybe it is something that's down beneath the earth.
And this is just Westcott's.
And I'm just reading it as being,
So this is the problem we run into with this. And again, that's why we have to make that distinction between whether or not we're actually dealing with these texts or if we're dealing with Westcott's kind of paying it forward to the Golden Dawn and that sort of thing.
But so here we have because we've been sort of all over the map, let's just state clearly, we're pretty sure I'm pretty sure that this is like a Gnostic text from the same tradition as the Pistis Sophia and written around the same time. I mean, not necessarily from the same tradition, but from that kind of one of the things under the umbrella of Gnosticism. And so here
let's say that's theory A, and I'm going to have theory B. We'll get to that.
And so, and you're right. This is influential on a lot of what became like Middle Platonists and stuff. But so here, even though earlier in the book, in the sections on creation, it seems like the mind and the soul come right from the Father. And maybe Father means more than one thing, like holy smokes. It's such a difficult text to understand. It came right from the Father, and the fire that makes creation, comes from fairly high up on in the order of emanations as well. Like, it doesn't seem like there's no fragment, at least included in this publication, that says, and then Hecate gave it to the evil demiurge, and then the evil demiurge created the evil world that we all inhabit. That doesn't seem to be part of this account. But then when it starts talking about magical precepts, it's just like, don't worry about any of the things of the earth wherein you are, spawned.
Yeah, I mean, like, my point of view on where this is coming from is just to touch on that. Like, again, I feel like it's a bit of a futile act because we're only going to get so much out of that. But it's like, clearly these are all the sources for this material are all these various writers, most of whom were interconnected to Constantinople, which Istanbul was once Constantinople. That's nobody's business but the jerks. So basically, I think that a lot of this stuff probably came to us via Ficinus. He's like a early Renaissance guy who's very very influential. He's actually quoted in here as well. He's like a Neoplatonist. He was trying to revive Neoplatonism, but he was also at that time when there was finally these texts were even being rediscovered by the West. So like Platonism had been lost, so Socrates had been lost, and all that sort of thing, and they survived through the Arabic tradition, the Middle Eastern tradition, because during the Dark Age that the West was experiencing, the Middle East was having a renaissance, a boom of sciences and all these things, and philosophy and art and religion, and they maintained these texts throughout that whole period, and they were rediscovered by the West and translated into Latin and this sort of thing, and so a lot of that stuff was rediscovered and reintroduced via, like, particularly in a Neoplatonic kind of way by Ficinus and others like him. So that's kind of interesting. But also, I mean, if we go back to those original Greek writers and that sort of thing, it has to be said that they're clearly referencing. We don't have the context of their references, so like how they're being used in their own writings. We only have the little snippet taken out of it and then pasted onto these other quotations as if they go together or something. But I mean, you can assume that these are people who are living in Greece or in Alexandria in Egypt, or that kind of portion of the world, and they're trying to reference Zoroastrianism apparently, and from there, Christian Neoplatonic kind of worldview. And they're clearly going to have to translate the stuff. They're using Greek god names and that sort of thing that correspond to these ideas. So I'm sure those Greek god names didn't actually exist in the original material or anything like that. They might have. I
suspect that they did, and I think at least the Wikipedia page says.
I didn't read the Wikipedia page.
So
I deprived myself of some important knowledge there.
So imagine that Hamlet goes out of print and all existing copies of Hamlet get destroyed. And so 200 years from now, nobody's ever read Hamlet, but we do have all these high school papers for some reason. Somebody discovers a cache of papers from a high school where the kids have been studying Hamlet. So we have about 16 well-attested quotations that all these kids have attributed to Shakespeare. So we pull out those 16 quotations and we say, we think this is what Hamlet was about. So my understanding is that at least the Wikipedia consensus is that that's kind of what's happened, is that, there are these Neoplatonic writers that were all influenced by the Chaldean Oracles of Johann the Chaldean, and explicitly are quoting Johann the Chaldean, and so we don't know what his book looked like, or if he existed, but we know probably around the second or third century, there was a book that had these 200 quotations in it. So I think there's the chain of evidence is you're right. It's a long chain of evidence, so we may be wrong about that, but I think that's what we think happened. And then
I would still say that
the
like,
attribution to Zoroaster is just dubious. Like Westcott's just wrong about that.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. But I mean, even in that case, it's like if we're translating these things into Greek, we're using Greek language and that sort of thing. So I feel like when you're changing it from language to language, there's certain things that get picked up and certain words that end up being used in order to communicate ideas and that sort of thing. So it's going to naturally look a little bit more Gnostic, for instance. Like it's going to be framed using potentially Gnostic terms and that sort of thing. But even then, it's like those are lost by the wayside if we don't have the original texts that they're being drawn out of. Although I don't know if we do. Maybe we do have these texts in their original Greek that we could go back and find. That would be pretty interesting, actually. I'm sure there's still like Proclus and that sort of thing that's being referenced in here, and Ficinus. But, you know, I would love to look up those actual original references just to see how this English translation has affected things as well.
Yeah, there's several translations of the oracles, of the fragments of the oracles, and then there's also, I'm sure, because this is where we get them from, like this book, like Proclutus on the Timaeus of Plato. Like, we could probably read that at some point if you wanted to.
I've been wanting to buy that for so long, and it's hard to get, and I think it's expensive. So
but you know, we could try to chase down some of these Neoplatonic sources and see what their influence is as well.
I mean, we should do the Timaeus at some point. That would be because that's a really important, foundational Platonic text.
Let's try to get a picture of this picture of creation.
I, who am an image of an image, say this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's our whole conversation for the last 10 minutes, is trying to find the chain of evidence on these images of images of images. Lots of early work is like this, right? Like, you just have to get it from attestation. There's like only 12 Greek dramas that survive, for example, and Heraclitus is only available in fragments, and various other things. We become aware of these books because other writers talk about them, and then we say they're mysterious, but then it's like, well, what do they say about them? Can we, all of our understanding of Gnosticism before the discovery of the
Nag Hammadi
library was based on this kind of hearsay. So it's just part of what it's like to do this kind of work. So the first page of this, the first 4 or 5 sections, are just devoted to talking about how perfect God is. And this perfect picture is the picture of Father Monad. And then I thought this was nice. Hence, the inscrutable God is called silent by the divine ones, and is said to consent with mind, and to be known to human souls through the power of their mind alone. We're getting some idea already of praxis, like what it would be like to be a Gnostic Christian, doing their mystic practices. Somehow we have this idea that mind is able to communicate all the way up into this, even though our creation process is complicated, we can communicate all the way up to the monad by using the power of our mind somehow. The Chaldeans call the god Dionysus or Bacchus, Iao in the Phoenician tongue, and he is called Zabaoth, signifying that he is above the 7 poles, that is, the demiurgos. And so here, this is our only mention of the demiurge in this text, and it's mysterious. All that it means is that the monad is above the demiurge. It doesn't say whether the demiurge creates anything. The Father apprehended himself. We're down in fragment 11 now. The Father apprehended himself. I assume apprehend means understand, not capture, and hath not restricted his fire to his own intellectual power. So here, fire is already entering the picture, even though we haven't even talked about mind yet. So we're starting to get some influence of the triad already.
And I mean, as far as Zarathustra goes and that sort of thing, it's like fire veneration that came about, especially in the later period and that. So
Yeah, I don't want to say there's nothing from Zoroastrianism in here. The book is not by Zoroaster. It's it's about 1,000 years or more too late. The Gnostics are showing the influence of Zoroastrianism.
And Zoroastrianism is still prevalent and vibrant throughout that period, like right up until 1,000 some odd. I think there's still Zoroastrianism.
It's practiced
around
unto
that sort
today,
of thing,
though.
but
It's tough over there. The Father apprehended himself and hath not restricted his fire to his own intellectual power. Such is the mind which energized before energy, while yet it has gone forth the abode of paternal depth in the attendum of God-nourished silence. I like this God-nourished silence.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of our readers might have heard that. Some of our listeners might have heard that somewhere. Such is the mind which is energized before energy, while yet it had not gone forth, but abode in the paternal depth and in the attendum of God-nourished silence. So somehow this fire, which is supposed to be the triad, is emanating from the monad and mingling around, and the mind is beginning to emerge. So the dyad's beginning to emerge, and the thing that I think is philosophically interesting about this is it's sort of like this picture of self-awareness emerging from like some sort of perception of movement. The energy is kind of swirling around, and that sort of feeds your consciousness. Was David Hume saying something about how we can't imagine things that don't exist? Everything in our, a unicorn, we know horns exist, we know horses exist, so we just imagine that we can assemble things, but without perception, we don't have mind. And there's a similar picture going on here about how this relationship between perceived and perceiver is, except it's more complicated here, because then the perceiver gives sustenance to what is perceived by perceiving it somehow. It's like the mind doesn't begin to exist until the object presents itself, but then the object can't continue to exist unless it's being perceived. It's a very strange picture. And then the second mind, all of a sudden we have a second mind. Oh no, sorry, all things have issued from that one fire. The Father perfected all things and delivered them over to the second mind, whom all nations of men called the first.
Really another interesting...
There's this Gnostic... Already we have this... it's not explicit that this is the demiurge. In fact, it seems to me like it's maybe the dyad or some emanation from the dyad. But we do have... But we're starting to have this idea of a God removed from God, right?
Yeah, I almost... the thing that I'm tempted to do is inflict my own sort of personal insights and stuff like that onto this. I want to call it the conception of the monad. The monad itself being a man-made conception that all nations of men call the first. It makes me think of like that vision that you quoted from, is it either 20 or either 19 from the Vision of the Voice, where it's the three figures on the wheel. Right. So we have the lamb up at the top of the wheel, and that lamb has deceived the very elect. And I feel like that lamb is kind of like this idolization, that idolatry of the monad in a sense.
And the second mind conducts the Empyrean world. What the intelligence saith, it saith by understanding. Power is with them, but mind is from him. And I'm reading this as all one sort of continuous block of text, because that's what it looks like here. It looks like, lines in a poem, but each of these has a separate attribution. Damascus, Pesilius, Platonius the theologian. You see how these fragments are assembled to feel like a poem.
Yeah.
But so these are three separate ideas. The second mind conducts the Empyrean world. What the intelligible saith, it saith by understanding. Power is with them, but mind is from him. Those seem like connected ideas, but they're all from separate fragments by separate authors quoting this one original text. So who knows how they go together. But I thought this was interesting because we have this idea of the second mind, and it starts to feel like, oh, maybe that's the demiurge, because they're saying that all people call it the first, but then it says it conducts the Empyrean world, and the Empyrean, based on, again, my cheap Google search and my Wikipedia articles and stuff, it looks like Empyrean for Christians means heaven. So this is like, even though this is not, the monad, the one indistinguishable thing from which all else emanates, this is still like the God in heaven doing,
to keep it contextualized,
things,
just based on Westcott's introduction, I think the Empyrean, it might be handy to think of it as Bria. Mm-hmm. So, it doesn't cause a problem with the idea of heaven, but it contextualizes it for the way that Westcott's framing this. It might help to get at least an insight into the way that he's putting this together and that sort of thing.
Sure. But I mean, if the usual Gnostic picture is that the demiurge is an evil spirit who's being worshipped as God, for everyone to call this second mind the first, that makes it seem like the evil spirit, but it's still way up close to the center of emanation, like in Bria doing the heaven thing. So it's not, I would question whether or not the evil enters the picture that early.
Well, that would be kind of like where from Bria down into Yetzirah is kind of where you're crossing the abyss, right?
Sure.
So, you could make an argument for that. And again, we're going with Westcott's kind of framing of this.
Hacked together.
Yeah. There's this one little portion here. Because it is the operator, because it is the giver of life-bearing fire, because it filleth the life-producing bosom of Hecate, and it instilleth into the Cenoches the enlivening strength of fire, endued with mighty power. That I could argue that that's maybe being placed here by Westcott to try and imply Hecate as kind of like this existing up there in Bina, maybe.
Yeah, I sort of tried to draw this a couple of different ways, and then the next section that's called Ideas, the creation story is told in about 4 sections here. The first section being cause, God, and then the second section being ideas. We have intelligibles, intellectuals, sorry, not intelligence, intellectuals, iengis, synokes, teletarches, fountains, principles, Hecate, and demons. And this is just a list of words, a lot of which I didn't know, and one of which I still don't know because Googling it gave me no and no good answers. My concise OED gave me no good answers. But so Hecate, at least in that list, is like the second last item in the list. And so if I'm pairing these things together and then going based on what we read here too, it looks like intelligibles and intellectuals go together, and then via the iengis, the fire goes straight down to Hecate, which I would be thinking of as being like almost like Malkuth, because of just where she shows up in the order of items on this list, and then passing the synokes and teletarches on the way. Meanwhile, the fountains and the principles are springing up everywhere around them. Like the energy is seen as being like the fire around these minds, the first mind, the second mind, the monad, the father, is seen as being kind of like a spiral force. It mentions spirals a couple of times in this text. So I thought maybe the fountains had something to do with this spiral of fire, because it's like, the spiral of fire coming in, and then maybe the emanation of whatever fluid coming out or something.
Yeah, with what I was learning about watching this video on Zarathustrianism or Zoroastrianism, it's fire is sacred, but also water is also sacred, and they're both supposed to be kept pure and that sort of thing, and they're both important principles. So it's in that respect, it does sort of also shadow forth some of these Chaldean ideas.
Sorry, where was that? What number was that fragment you were reading about Hecate?
Oh, let me bring that back up. Sorry. Yeah, I had jumped the gun and moved on to the ideas in that one. That was fragment number 54.
54, yeah. So...
actually, I might be mistaken. 55.
55. Yeah, I had that marked out to read too, and and the reason is I think it's interesting because if you're used to being a tree of life person, and it comes to mind because the word supernals shows up here a couple of times. You think Kether Chokmah Bina, and then Chesed, Gevura, Tifereth, and then Yesod, Hod, and Netzach.
Yeah.
It's like these pairs of parents keep emanating a third one, and it's successive all the way down. Whereas I thought that was interesting because straight from the top, maybe not the top, but maybe not Chokmah and Bina, but maybe like Chesed and Gevura sort of emanate Yesud or Malkuth right away, right? Like they're...
But on that point, like with these Inges, or however we want to pronounce these things, well, there's going to be multiple pronunciations on this episode, I'm sure. Inges, Telatarkai, and Sinoches. What was coming to my mind was thinking of those as Briatic, like, or maybe even just like archangels and angels, like kind of corresponding to some of these ideas as well. So like, I guess there's ways in which you could picture these moving down the tree. You could also picture them being in a particular one of the four worlds or something like that. But again, the problem that we run into is we're kind of each seeing this in our own layout, which is not surprising.
Yeah, no, you have to kind of... I'm at a frustrating stage with this, where I can tell you what it means, but then when I try to draw I've read it enough times that I have developed an interpretation where I can tell you what I think it means.
Exactly.
But then when I go back to cherry pick the quotes that support my position, I start wondering. It becomes nebulous again because I'm like, oh, why did I make that decision? Why did I think that meant that? If fire means about three things here,
there's a lot of inference.
Why did I pick that meaning for this passage?
There's a lot of interpolation and that sort of thing. It's not, a structured, ordered thing that that we want it to be. That's saying one thing.
So quickly going back to I have to finish up the supernals before we move on to this much more complicated picture.
If you're having fun so far, wait.
Fragment 22, for not in matter did the fire which is the first beyond enclose his active power, but in mind. For the framer of the fiery world is the mind of mind. So again, fire is the triad, mind is the dyad, the framer is probably the monad, but the framer of the fiery world is the mind of mind, and who first sprang from the mind, clothing the one fire with the other fire. Here we have the clue that the fire is not a technical term because there's all these fires everywhere, binding them together that he might mingle the fountainous craters, while preserving unsullied the brilliance of his own fire. So if the fire is this kind of like feminine principle, it's the fire that ends up being the world or creating the world. Like often it says like the fire is it says like the fire is the soul, and the soul uses feminine pronouns in this. So the fire is like Binah, right? Like sort of. But here it's like his own fire is mentioned. And then the last thing I wanted to read from this section is fragment 25-26. The monad first existed, and the paternal monad still subsists. When the monad is extended, the dyad is generated. And then it seems like the generating of the dyad from the monad involves this third thing that is the fire. And so, and then somewhere it'll say that these supernals, this supernal kind of triad exists in at all the layers of the creation, all the way down. The father, the paternal monad, is going to say at some point, oh yeah, the mind of the father says that all things should be cut into three, whose will assented, and immediately all things were so divided. So creation is emanated out from this, dividing things into three parts.
Yeah, and you can very much see how this would appeal to Neoplatonic people who are also Christians, building on this Trinity idea.
The whole first section is about this Trinity of like triune powers, right? The Father, the mind, and the fire. And it's quite different than Nuit Hadit Ra Horquit, but you can it accounts for a lot of the same things, right? Like, I mean, this fire that is the creative principle that goes out and ends up building the material world and all the cosmos and putting souls in man. Fire, we might think of the fires that get started during wartime, and then Thelema has this idea of, being refined through battle, as brothers fight ye. Thus we bring out saliently the difference between 2 points of view, or like refine thy rapture or something. At least in this aeon, with Ra Horquit having taken his seat in the east at the equinox of the gods, fire doesn't seem like it should be a creative force, but it is, and battle doesn't seem like it should be a creative force, but battle is sort of like building our world in the aeon of Horus, and the monad being the father from which all springs. That might sound like Hadit, the going, or like the Tao from the Tao Te King that we were talking about. But in Crowley's paper on the Chaldean Oracle of the the Chaldean Order of the Tree of Life, he sort of says that the one point gives you existence, but you don't really have stuff until you have a second point to compare it to. So it's nonsense to say whether the monad is infinitely small or infinitely large. It just kind of is, and in that way, you can imagine it's the grounds of existence, and that makes this father principle seem more like Nuit. And then mind, even though mind is expansive and reflects all the grounds of existence, mind is also our point of perspective. So there's important things to notice that are differences between this Chaldean oracle picture of the Trinity and the Thelemic picture of our Trinity. But if you kind of squint and look at it sideways, you see how a lot of the same elements are accounted for, right? There's existence, there's perspective, there's the creative and scintillating fire that builds as it burns. And, again, the reason to do some of this Gnostic stuff is to wonder what justifies calling Thelema a Gnostic discipline. And so when we notice these things that build analogies to each other, it's helpful to point them out.
Yeah, I think that's as good an excuse as I can come up with for jumping into this little spot in Liber 418, The Vision and the Voice, that references the Oracles of Zoroaster. In the 17th Aether, there's a lot of talk of ideas pertaining to justice and that sort of thing, but it does get to a point where it's saying, "And the chemical marriage of the alchemists beginneth with a weighing. And he that is not found wanting hath within him one spark of fire, so dense and so intense that it cannot be moved, though all the winds of heaven should clamor against it, and all the waters of the abyss surge against it, and all the multitude of the earths heap themselves upon it to smother it." So the fire that can't be distinguished by the other elements. "Nay, it shall not be moved. And this is the fire of which it is written, Hear thou the voice of fire. And the voice of fire is in the 2nd chapter of the book of the law, that is revealed unto him that is 1.5 and 3 that are scores and 6, by Iwaz, that is his guardian, the mighty angel that extendeth from the first unto the last, and maketh known the mysteries that are beyond." It's saying in the notes here, this spark is Hadit. He cannot be moved because he is already in motion at the limit of velocity. And another one that refers to the Oracle of Zoroaster says, "And when after all the phantoms are vanished shall appear that holy and formless fire, that fire which darts and flashes throughout the depths of the universe. Hear thou the voice of fire." And this is the utterance of Hadit, the deepest expression of one's inmost point of view.
Yeah, I mean, if what you have is this, the Pistis Sophia, a couple of German translations of fragments, you can sort of see how we justify thinking of Thelema as being in the Gnostic tradition, because that's very good, right? And says some of the things that I was just sort of hypothesizing, although it's mapped slightly different. Like I was thinking of fire as being Ra Horquid, and here fire is Hadid, but like that's fine, you know. It's the
Not to mention, you were also mentioning the idea of these trinities.
sure, yeah,
And it's like it does throughout this Zoroastrian text permeate down through the whole, creation of the universe, sort of thing.
And this idea of a creative fire. Again, even though I think this is pretty firmly Gnostic via Middle Platonism, the way in which the influences of the Zoroastrian worship, you see it in this, especially in these talks of like the sacred fire and stuff like that. Yeah. So moving into the second section of this, which is called Ideas. I think this is not necessarily about epistemology. I think the idea of ideas here is more like the aeons or the archons that we were talking about in Pistis Sophia. They're like ideas in the mind of God, right? So the layers of emanation that become the grounds of creation. And so and there's this little dramatas personal that's going to tell us who we're talking about. I don't know whether this is a creation of Waite or not Waite, Westcott or one of the translators, or whether this exists in one of the original fragments. It's not cited, so this makes me think maybe it comes from the translator. But anyway, it lists them in an order here: intelligibles, intellectuals, iengis, synokes, teletarches, fountains, principles, Hecate, and demons. And when we were talking about the Pistis Sophia, we were talking about we had a nice diagram that looked like rings within rings, and how the various emanations of the treasury of light radiated out from the center, and then the various aethers radiated out from there, and that there was, but here the picture's a little bit more complicated, and I've already talked about how I have tried to draw it, but we have these, rather than direct emanations out from a center making concentric spheres or spirals or something, we have like pairs of complements. No, I was going to say opposites, but like pairs of complements that work together and then create offspring that then also work together. So it's much more like the Thelemic picture, when Crowley talks about like the tree of life, or like what's this word for royals in the tarot? What's that? What's the
court cards?
Yeah, the court cards of the tarot. It's a more complicated diagram about how all these things sort of interact. And I think one thing we can do, we've already talked about it a little bit, but I think one thing we can pay closer attention to, especially in relationship to the David Hume that we already talked about, is the way the intellect and intelligibles interact with each other. Actually, I have the first few paragraphs of this marked out to read too, but let's skip down to 44. For intellect existeth not without the intelligible, apart from it subsisteth not. By intellect he containeth the intelligibles, and introduceth the soul unto the worlds. By intellect he containeth the intelligibles, and introduceth sense into the worlds. Let's see if we can make heads or tails of this. I mean, this idea that the intellect doesn't exist without the intelligible, we've already sort of talked about how that works in Hume and other places, the way that mind builds up from sense information. But then the intelligible, all those objects then being sustained by the intellect, that makes it seem more like an idealist picture where the objects of the world just are all ideas. And because the grounds of existence is the emanations of the ideas from the mind of God, that might actually be correct here, because God has this ideas and has this ideas and then that creates discrete objects, and then we encounter those discrete objects, that gives us mind, but then our minds, those ideas are in our mind, so we contribute to the sustenance and creation by sharing in those ideas.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think the way that you're looking at this is the intelligibles being those things that are being apprehended by the intellect. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think when something's intelligible, it means you can understand it. So I think one way to read this, if you were going to read it epistemologically, which I think is not quite correct, but let's just do it for fun because of the thread we've been following this season. So I think that might mean sense objects, right? These are things you can comprehend. There's a book in front of you. You can look at it, you can touch it, you can read it. And so the what's intelligible reacts to what's reacts
which
with
is an
the
interesting
intellect.
It's an interesting take on it, because I wasn't reading it that way, but that makes a lot more sense in terms of why to use the term intelligible. And then you can start to talk about it as, well, the thing that's intelligible is not the same as our conceptualization of it, as much as that conceptualization is an attempt to apprehend that thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think what this is talking about is actually things happening way up early on in the order of creation.
That's the thing, yeah.
So that the intelligibles and intellectuals, those are like angels. Those are orders of spiritual being that are they're making love with each other and and casting a fire down so that Hecate can create creation with their,
Yeah, basically, just to clarify, because it's like you've got a clear way that you're looking at this, and the way that I was looking at it, I'm not sort of offering this as the correct way or like countering. I'm just basically kind of interested in the fact that it's, it is just we're engaging with the text differently, and that means, hey, we can, if I kind of switch to understanding your point of view, that's going to be helpful. Like, I'm seeing this as the intelligible is like Berea, and then the intellectual is the next level down, sort of in the Ruach. And so that's the way I've been kind of trying to conceptualize this. And however, the term intelligible becomes somewhat meaningless or arbitrary in that kind of application, and that's one of the reasons I was not really clear that I was understanding things the correct way. And one of the reasons I'd love to actually be able to trace down, I want to spend some time trying to trace down these original texts so that I can see what the original Greek or whatnot would have been in those cases, just out of curiosity, because that's often that often reveals quite a bit.
That's right. And I think you're kind of right to think of it more abstractly than I am. But I think because the original Trinity is Father and Mind and Fire, when it comes down and we start talking about intellect and intellectuals, I think that and then because this we've already talked about how the Trinity kind of permeates all of existence and comes all the way down, and that there's this quotation in the first chapter that says something like God is not comprehensible to mind, but something like
ineffable or something.
No, it's a sexual metaphor, I think.
God's like a hard cock.
Yes, that's well, that's wild that I went there. This is this shows the zeitgeist of our age. God is said to consent with mind, and I just assume that's sexual. But so
well, God's just virtue signaling.
But so there's this relationship between deity and mind that all the way up to the highest level, right? Father consents with mind, and so I think that because it's the thoughts of God that are are creating these creative principles that then create everything, I think it's not entirely wrong to think of their relationship the relationship between the angels called intellectuals and the angels called intelligibles as being sort of like the way objects and intellect interact, you know?
Yeah, and I guess does sort of point out, like, as just as a brief aside, as we were talking about earlier, it's like as you engage with this text, you find yourself making sense of it out of it with your own kind of approach and framework. So it is interesting, even just linguistically, using a term like consent in this capacity. This translation was originally in the 1700s, was it?
I think so.
I forget exactly, but point being, it's like then being compiled by Westcott as like in the late 1800s, and so at each of those periods of time, English language, had certain different mores and that sort of thing. So if you read something from Victorian writings, you kind of have to adapt to the sort of norms of writing and speech at that time. Whereas if you're used to thinking of things in modern parlance and that, it's going to have different connotations and that sort of thing. So we're at so many levels of remove here.
Yeah. And we just have, and so, which is, I think it's a good idea for us to revisit it in a way that's closer sometime later. But for now, we have to deal with what's on the page because, partly because I think if we're right that this is what Crowley's talking about when he says the oracle, read the oracles of Zoroaster, then this is probably what he was reading.
Yeah.
So any influence it has on Thelema is going to be via this volume. Now here's a complicating picture. I don't see where it says yet that the fire goes straight down to Hecate, but here's something that complicates the picture because you'd imagine as sort of tree of life people that those first two principles somehow birth the next two principles, and those next two principles work together to birth the next two principles. But that's not exactly what it says. Now it calls the intelligible ings themselves understand from the Father, by ineffable counsels being moved so as to understand. So the ings, which seem like they should be the offspring of the intellectuals and the intelligibles, are themselves both understand, and they're intelligible ENGs, and they have understanding. Yeah. So it's like they're repackaged back up in with all the things that are above, just like the mind was repackaged into the Father, and the fire was repackaged into the mind and the Father.
Yeah, the note that I made for verses 39 through 53 is that it seems like describing how the Father is progressively clothed or sheathed by the further emanations, which also sort of vein off and become increasingly multitudinous, or create the conditions for the perception of multitude.
Very good remark. Very, very good.
Thank you.
55, because it is the operator, because it is the giver of life-bearing fire, because it filleth the life-producing blossom of Hecate. There it is. So because it is the operator, because it is the giver of life-bearing fire, because it filleth the life-producing bosom of Hecate. So there's my idea where the fire that's shared between these upper principles comes straight down to the what we would call the bottom of the tree to Hecate, so that she can create the world. That's my interpretation of because it filleth the life-producing bosom of Hecate, and installeth into the Sinokes the enlivening strength of the fire, endued with mighty power. So it's almost like because the Sinokes in that first preface seemed like they were above Hecate. So it's like the Anges and the intelligibles and the intellectuals are working together to produce this fire that comes down, filleth the bosom of Hecate, and then explodes out from there, and she's actually able to feed back up into higher levels, which is along the lines of what we saw in the otherwise very different Pistis Sophia, right? Where the outer rings were supposed to be working hard to return the energy to the center. Right?
All of this kind of stuff does bring to my mind very often. It's almost like what you would get in this ancient period of history, like looking at the nature of mind, spending a lot of time in meditation and that sort of thing, and looking at the way that mind operates, and clearly inferring from that the universe at large works in much the same way, being able to see that as above, so below kind of thing.
And here's a couple more evidences that this kind of object-observer relationship starts to emanate its way down through all the levels of creation. Likewise, as many as serve the material synokes, the teletarches are comprehended in the synokes. So there's the same kind of relationship comprehended in the synokes. It's just like what it's saying about intellect and intelligibles, working together mentally, unto the intellectual, this is 63 now, unto the intellectual whirlings of intellectual fire, all things are subservient through the pervasive counsel of the Father. So the Father is counseling, there's whirlings of intellectual fire, and then further down there is another fountain which leadeth the Empyrean world. So the way Westcott has this structured, it's almost, because the question of what fountain means, I don't quite understand it. I've thought it has to do with fire, even though fountain is a watery image. But the way all these things are swirling around, comprehending each other, and then feeding back up to the center, there's this it sort of feels like a fountain, right? With a pump that recycles the water back into the system. Mm-hmm. And so then when this fragment is added quite close that says, and then there's another fountain which leadeth the Empyrean world. That means, for Christians, that means like the heavens. So here we have this picture of this fountain being the fountain of creation, and then maybe on a successive ring out from that, the heavens, and then another thing like this, a fountain maybe, is the leading the Empyrean the world of the Empyreans.
Yeah, and I can't help looking at the analogy of the Kabbalistic worldview and the Tree of Life and that sort of thing, particularly through the eyes of the Golden Dawn, because the image that comes to mind is the Tree of Life as the Garden of Eden. So in the pre-fall period, the four rivers of the Garden of Eden, sort of moving outward from the Garden of Eden and that sort of thing from on the Tree of Life, as displayed on the Tree of Life. And I wonder if that's kind of a good analogy for these fountains.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Can you say more about the picture that you were developing? Because I worked hard to kind of create a map of what I thought this looked like, but I admit that that's my own work, and maybe I've cherry-picked too much or sort of misunderstood certain things, so it would be helpful to get like somebody else's cherry picking and map making and stuff. Maybe we can triangulate to something that's more correct.
Yeah, and that's just it. That's what I mean. It's that's what we're looking at. I'm viewing this very much starting with the model of the four worlds, and I think that's probably the safest way for me to start with a simplification of it, and then from there trying to work things into some kind of a framework. So pretty much seeing it as, like the four worlds where we have, Yechida at the very top, that's sort of like the Godhead, and then Bria, which is sort of the archangelic level, and then going into Yetzirah, the formative world that we, have as the Ruach exists in and that sort of thing, so the intellectual part, but also whatever, pertains to conceptualization of that, and then the Nefesh, so the and I guess that's Asiya, the animal soul level of things.
And I think you've been sort of mixing consciousness terms with world terms. I think the Yechida is consciousness, and Atziluth is going to be the corresponding world, maybe.
Yeah, I've got my words a little bit jumbled up.
It's
that's
okay.
True.
We're speaking extemporaneously. It's very difficult.
Yeah, and as that pertains to the four-letter name of God, Tetragrammaton, that's kind of like my shorthand for that in my mind is, you have Yud, He, Vav, He. So you have Yud for the initial highest level, and that's attributed to fire. And then it goes down to He, which the mother, the initial He, and that's the Briatic level. That's the fire passing through that formation stage, sort of like the cup is the image that comes to mind for that. The fire of the Yud is like the wand, the magician's wand. And then the water of the He is the cup that provides the vessel. And then from there, we go to the vow, or vav, which is the sun, and is air and the sword, and that, or the dagger. And that's sort of like directing force in a sense. And then we finally have the concretion in the hay final, which is the daughter, and that's the manifest form.
I like that. Concretion. Never heard that before. Yeah, no, that's very good. And so where do you think these sort of, I mean, I can guess, but where do you think these sorts of layers lie on that tree? There, for our audience who haven't necessarily looked at this book, the introduction has exactly this kind of thing, with Westcott trying to lay out a similar map to the one Darren's imagining. So even though it's anachronistic, Kabbalah sort of being 16th century and this being, fourth, he's, because we're dealing with this text, he's right to do that, because it's sort of what Westcott's project is. Yeah.
And this is what the Golden Dawn's taking this and doing with it as well, I would imagine. So, but I mean, as far as these entities go, I kind of assume that they're probably being taken as corresponding to the different levels of angels and archangels and the thrones of these kinds of ideas. I don't know how perfect the analogies are, but and I don't have a complete, I haven't gone to the point of lining them all up and that sort of thing. But that's kind of the way I'm viewing them.
I think it's pretty good, because usually Binah is water, and so we have an elemental picture in the supernals that's like air, fire, water. But if you take the supernals as being this this trinity, right, of father, mind, fire, and then that fire comes down and passes through, like they become kind of the yod when you simplify it to the tetragrammaton, and maybe that passes down through.
And you can see where this would work for these Neoplatonic Christians as well, because we have Father, mind being the Son, and then fire being the Holy Spirit.
Sure.
So we have that trinity there.
And maybe the intellectuals and the intelligibles are that first hay, and the fire is coming through that, like the water of mind, right?
Yeah.
In lots of places, people who meditate think of the mind as being fluid, right? We've had that argument about whether or not chitta was a valuable term, right? But if you think of this mind stuff as being both malleable and ungraspable, then it does start to feel liquidy. So it's not wild to think that these people who are talking about meditative work, it seems like, right, the Father is consents with mind, that they would think of these, even though the fire that passes through the intellectuals is passing through some sort of watery barrier. So yeah, you can totally imagine like Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey, yeah.
And I do like the taking that different slant of like playing with the idea of the intelligibles being the thing that the intellectuals are apprehending, because the intelligible in itself would, in a sense, be watery as well, where it's like there's no real differentiation. It's like this whole sea, whereas the nature of the intellectuals is to divide things into separate, discrete ideas, and thereby apprehend the intelligibles. It's basically kind of fodder for meditation and that sort of thing. And I think that's one of the benefits to this, is not to get too hung up on what's the right or correct view, but more just sort of allow it to feed your meditation and spark off ideas and that sort of thing.
We should talk about these fountains and principles as well.
And the fountain of fountains.
Yeah. So, and I
and the boundary of all fountains.
It's all in there. 67. There is another fountain which leadeth the Empyrean world. 68. The fountain of fountains, the boundary of all fountains. 69. Under two minds, the life-generating fountain of the soul is comprehended. Beneath them exists the principal one of the immaterials. So we still haven't even gotten to the we still haven't gotten to material yet. Like the e-materials are even beneath this. And all fountains and principles whirleth round, and always remain in ceaseless revolution. The principles which have understood the intelligible works of the Father, he hath clothed in sensible works and bodies, being intermittent links existing to connect the Father with matter, rendering apparent the images of unapparent natures, and inscribing the unapparent and the apparent frame in the world. So these fountains are somehow, beneath the fountains are the unintelligibles, but somehow the fountains are working with the principles and via the fire of the Father. So again, we're wrapping each new successive layer back up into the monad. But somehow it's at this level of principles that the material world is beginning to be created. And again, this has echoes in all the way up till the 18th century, with people like the idealists. Kant has some idea that the world is divided into special categories, and those are things like extension and number and fundamental things that make consciousness, like that pre-exist. Even though the mind is built of sense impressions, there are these things that we have to have innate that pre-exist sense impressions, so that we can begin to interpret the world. Like I think we have to have sequences before we can have numbers or something like that for Kant. I can't remember it, but yeah, there's it's the principles that begin to make what we would think of as matter. And so by dividing up the world into definable segments, we begin to have existence.
And this is nice too. It goes on to number 74, where we have Typhon, Echidna, and Python. I'm not sure about Echidna. I don't know anything about that one, but being the progeny of Tartaros and Gaia, who were united by Uranus, form, as it were, a certain Chaldean triad, the inspector and guardian of all the disordered fabrications. And that's kind of interesting because it's a triad of, two of the three at least seem serpentine in some respects, and remind me of what we went through, or what we saw in Liber Samek with the three forms that I was sort of bringing up appear in the Golden Dawn material in the Equinox 1-2, where there's in Yesod, on the temple, the mapping of the temple in Yesod, there's these three serpents, or three satanic forms, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to omit that, but it's good that you brought it in, because it's the last of our players in this story of creation, these demons, and it seems, and if Hecate's bosom is being filled with fire, and that's doing all the creation, then spinning off even from that are these further sort of like another class of immaterial beings that are the demons, both beneficial and maleficent.
Yeah, and I think the work of the Golden Dawn was largely to syncretize a lot of different ideas from different areas and that sort of thing. So that's like, even if we are kind of cross-pollinizing these different spiritual ideas and things, that's what the Golden Dawn was doing. I mean, that was one of Crowley's criticisms, I think, about the Golden Dawn material, was that when you go through this initiation, which is a little over verbose with the amount of information it's dumping on you, and then you get a whole bunch of information handed to you that you can't really cover entirely before you're already off and running to the next one. So and a lot of it's combining ideas that from these different spiritual practices and backgrounds, and even languages and things. So there's like the Coptic stuff that no one ever uses nowadays.
I'm trying to decide how much of the next two sections to read, because I think we should address, of course, magical and philosophical precepts to the degree that we're able. We continue with the story of creation now, talking about the creation of particular souls and the creation of matter.
Yeah, definitely from particular souls. I'll just mention number 83. The soul of man does in a manner clasp God to herself. So the soul does clasp God to herself. Having nothing mortal, she is wholly inebriated with God, for she glorieth in the harmony under which the mortal body subsisteth.
Yeah. So here souls are, we're using feminine pronouns for all the souls.
Which matches the idea of Bria, if we want to kind of like relate that level to Briatic.
79, for the Father of gods and man placed the mind nous in the soul psyche, and placed both in the human body. The paternal mind hath sowed symbols in the soul, having mingled the vital spark from the two according substances, mind and divine spirit. To the third he adds holy love, the venerable character, the charioteer uniting all things, filling the soul with profound love. I thought it was going to say something about the fire, the mind, but it's mind and soul that are united together. So anyway, that's I was trying to justify thinking of that third principle, that fire, as being the feminine element, but maybe mind is the feminine element, because it says mind and soul and human body, and then starts calling them female. So there's some feminine element that enters in there.
Yeah, and water is a symbol of life. Hence, Plato and the gods before Plato call it the soul. At one time, the whole water of vivification, and at another time, a certain fountain of it. So referring to the soul as water and relating it to that. So again, we have that formlessness and that sort of thing. And for thy vessel, the beasts of the earth shall inhabit. I don't know why that's inserted in there, but it does remind me of the Enochian call of the Aethers. It's a little bit, it's not exactly the same wording, but it's kind of like their houses be occupied by the beasts and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Caves for the beasts.
Oh, this is just an interesting aside here, talking about how the picture of redemption in here. 87, the souls of those who quit the body violently are most pure. The girders of the soul, which give her breathing, are easy to be unloosed. For when you see a soul set free, the Father send us another, that the number may be complete. So, again, from Enochian reference, right? There are no more people now than there ever have been or ever will be, or something like this.
And the girders of the soul referenced in the Book of the Law as well, lightening the girders of the soul.
Oh, yeah, separating that, which here seems to mean death, right? And then, of course, we're firmly in a Christian tradition now, 300 or 400 years after the passing of Christ. So the souls of those who quit the body, the souls that quit the body violently are most pure.
Yeah.
So there's that influence.
So I feel like we're just cherry picking at this point, but
yeah, I mean, this picture of creation here, that it seems these chapters seem less well done to me. You know, like it's already a dubious project to try to organize fragments into narrative, and then here it seems like these were sort of like, well, we got to put them somewhere, so let's pop them in here.
I'll just read this and see where it takes us. Since the soul perpetually runs and passes through many experiences in a certain space of time, which being performed it is presently compelled to do, pass back again through all things and unfold a similar web of generation in the world, according to Zoroaster, who thinketh that as often as the same causes return, the same effects will in like manner be sure to ensue. So that's kind of like, seems like it's implying reincarnation may just simply be sort of the principle of eternal return or something along those lines.
Yeah, it reminded me of eternal return. It could also be like proto-scientific philosophy saying that, like, you know, effects follow causes, and that we can do experiments, and that but also because effects follow causes, birth has consequences, and then you're going to live a human life.
Yeah.
and there's no avoiding it.
Yeah,
And
you can observe patterns.
and
that
so
sort of
like
thing.
we are presently compelled to do the things of this existence, and so a certain amount of aestheticism may be appropriate, but you can't avoid being in the world altogether or something like that. That seems like it predicts talking about magical and philosophical precepts a little later on.
And then, of course, we have this big, long passage here. The most celebrated of the Babylonians, together with Austin and Zoroaster, very properly called the starry spheres herds, whether because these alone among corporeal magnitudes are perfectly carried about around a center, or in conformity to the oracles, because they are considered by them as in a certain respect the bands and collectors of physical reasons, which they likewise call in their sacred discourse herds, and the Greek term is agelus. And by the insertion of a gamma, it gives angels, angelus. Wherefore, the stars which preside over each of these herds are considered to be deities or daimons, similar to the angels, and are called archangels, and they are 7 in number. And that sounds like the planets.
Yes. When you see 7s, you can think of planets. And then, of course, we're already talking about starry spheres and stuff, so the travelers are a good guess.
The wanderers, yeah.
And so that brings us to the end of our section on matter. What did you want to say about this thing about the planets and the Babylonians and the Austines and stuff?
Not a whole hell of a lot.
Okay.
But it is interesting that it's giving kind of a worldview. I mean, we have the Chaldean order of the planets, so it, again, seems to allude to the idea that we have this conception of the concentric spheres working out from the Earth. So conceptualizing the center around which they move being the center of the Earth, I would presume.
Yeah, because if you're talking about the creation of existence, you have to eventually talk about existence, right? And so there's this section in Genesis where Adam walks around the garden saying, and the dog he called dog, and the dolphin he called dolphin, and the fifth of bourbon he called a fifth of bourbon. In some ways it's the least interesting part of the account, but you actually have to account for what's created. So, you're building this ontology that has gods and successive layers of emanation, and eventually you have to get to matter and say, yes, of course, there's planets and stars and water and fish and birds, and that seems to be a lot of what's going on in this section on matter. So, just some examples of what I was saying here. The sun more true measureth all things by time, being itself the time of time according to the oracles of the gods concerning it. It's just, it's, of course we measure time by the sun. Of course the sun exists. The disk of the sun is born in the starless realm above the intergalactic sphere, and hence is not in the midst of the planets, but of the 3 worlds according to the telistic hypothesis. So, there's some account of what's actually physically seen in the physical world going on here, which seems to me like and stuff about the vast sun and the brilliant moon, the wide air, the lunar course, the poles of the sun. It's all stuff that seems missable to me, but is a vital part of the account.
Well, it's relevant as well because it does ground the thing back in its own sort of forum.
Yeah.
Whereas we're trying, it's so easy for us to process it through our own in the light of all the things that we've got, like including Kant and the Golden Dawn and all these things. So, but like for instance, the passage that I'm looking for, I remember being on the last thing, the sort of sum up, but it was along the lines of pretty much breaking it down like, well, there's this fire that it seems like it's describing it essentially outside of the outer sphere of the cosmos, so that it's shining through the stars and through the planets even more so, and the sun most of all, and it's sort of shining down through these things. So that's like, that sounds a little bit more like a naive kind of, meditation on where you're looking up at the night sky and you're kind of imagining the stars as being like holes poked in some ceiling and that sort of thing. But, such conceptions did exist at the time, and that does, it's grounding to consider it that way. But then again, maybe there's further meditation you can have on these ideas as well.
So let's move into our final section here, which is called the magical and philosophical precepts. And I've already sort of said that the first few fragments here are about not to-dos. We've read this thing of stoop not down unto the darkly splendid world wherein continually lieth a faithless depth. It basically says don't do astrology, don't do fortune telling, don't try to read entrails, and then don't stoop too far down into the material world at all, or perhaps into the hells below the material world, depending on how you
Seems
read
like
these
very
fragments.
much like the Christian sort of idea of worldly things are corrupting, and we want to escape from worldly things.
Another thing not to do, which may be familiar to some of our listeners, change not the barbarous names of evocation, for there are sacred names in every language which are given by God, having in the sacred rites a power ineffable. And I remember when I first looked at that in Liber Semech, so many years ago, that I wanted to say something about how the names were barbarous and how chanting the nonsense phrases was sort of brain-breaking and took you out of your normal consciousness, and that there was something about the foreignness of them that was important. That was my interpretation, because I was reading it as being a suggestion from Crowley in a paper he was writing, and that I sort of had this idea of Crowley as a relatively modern person with relatively modern views, seeming to be, although he would hate this word, seeming to be agnostic, accepting spirits when he said publicly I believe in no God, privately I believe in them all, or something like that, right? But it's putting it in this 3rd century context, I'm realizing what it actually says. There are names in every language which are given by God. And so you don't change them because they're correct. You can't just say any fucking nonsense. You have to say this.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean don't translate the words into English because you don't want to understand what they mean. It means don't change them.
Yeah, keep them
It means what it says.
Yeah. Which is fun because it just points out the way that all of us tend to rationalize things and frame them so that they're... And which is kind of just one previous line there is 152, defile not the spirit, nor deepen a superficies. And this is one of those lines that I feel like you can meditate on and maybe get more out of. That to me says, defile not the spirit, so try not to lose touch with the actual spirit of the thing. And nor deepen a superficies would be like get too attached to the sort of the image of what you're trying to.
Yeah, it means like don't worship idols.
Exactly.
Right?
It's along the same lines as don't worship idols. Precisely.
The superficies, not really superficies, but surfaces. But then we sort of started to get a positive picture of what kind of activities one should be doing. And so I thought that this was helpful to read lots of this stuff because Thelema is practice oriented. And so what are these Gnostics doing in terms of a practice, and what does Crowley think we can get from reading Westcott on early forms of practice? It becometh you to hasten unto the light, and to the rays of the Father, from whom was sent unto you a soul, a psyche, endued, and with much mind, nous, seek paradise. Learn the intelligible, for it subsisteth beyond the mind. There is a certain intelligible one, whom it becometh you to understand with the flower of the mind. But the paternal mind accepteth not the aspiration of the soul until she hath passed out of her oblivious state and pronounced the word regarding the memory of the pure paternal soul. So it's very difficult to know what this means, but it seems to be talking about a practice of contemplation, of study and contemplation, and it begins with some sort of with the pronunciation of some sacred word, right? Change not the barbarous names of your vocation, for they are given in every language by God. And so there's some there's some sort of initiation process, and it even mentions that explicitly somewhere down the line, where you're given something that you grip onto, and it begins this process of it almost makes me think of we speak without total irreverence occasionally of the dangerous cult of transcendental meditators by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
We just lost one of the important practitioners as well, David Lynch. Passed away recently.
Rest in power, Lynch. I don't want to. I was going to say I don't like to mourn too much for celebrities because they have families and stuff. Yeah. You know, I remember being shaken up when Jim Henson died.
Oh yeah,
and like being very upset about that, and thinking like, but if you just showed me a 50 pictures of guys with beards, I wouldn't know which one he was. You know, like he had kids.
Yeah.
Like what right do I have?
You're mourning yourself. You're mourning a part of yourself.
Yeah. And then I saw the Muppet movie and I cried for 2 hours. But so you know, very sad. David Lynch. His body of work is incredible. He lived to be 78.
Yeah, I feel like when somebody lives to that age, that's good for them. You know, it's like I don't feel like it's like such a tragedy that he like died at the regular term of life.
Thank God there's going to be no more Twin Peaks. That's my fear. That's what I'm afraid of, is that now that he's dead, they'll somehow be able to steal Twin Peaks and produce a bunch of Disney seasons.
Yeah, really.
But
getting back to these phrases, actually, one of the things you could get out of it as well is kind of like seeing it as the describing in some terms the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. In that sense, as the aspirant is working up the tree and that sort of thing, the aspirant is always feminine to the masculine, negative to the positive above, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of it as well. The paternal mind accepteth not the aspiration of the soul until she hath passed out of her oblivious state and pronounceth the word, regaining the memory of the pure paternal symbol. So, interesting ideas to meditate on, for sure.
Well, this idea of an initiation ritual organized around a word makes me think of the TM people and how each one of them is supposedly given after a few days of some seminar or something. Supposedly given a whole unique individual mantra that's just for them, that they then work with for the whole rest of their lives. I suspect this is not that. I suspect there's one sort of keyword for the cult.
And because of the context, I would suggest that it would be maybe, just as in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that sort of thing. It probably ties in, especially because this is coming to us through Neoplatonic writers. It's probably pertaining to that conceptualization of the Word as well.
That's right. Very good. And a little further down, speaking of this intelligible one, again, remember that the intelligibles are orders of being, as we described earlier. Thou wilt not comprehend it as one understands some common thing. Ye who understand know the supra-mundane paternal depth. Things divine are not attainable by mortals who understand the body alone, but only by those who, stripped of their garments, arrive at the summit, having put on completely armed vigor by resounding light, with triple strength fortifying the soul and mind, he must put into the mind the various symbols, and not walk dispersedly on the Empyrean path, but with concentration. For being furnished with every kind of armor and armed, he is similar to the goddess. Let's remember the Pistis Sophia, what it means to strip off your garments, right? Like eventually Christ's vestiture just becomes his mortal body. We start with some idea of a vestiture of light, but in human body, even we come not to this summit. We have to strip it off and then be armed with mind, with light, with a collection of symbols. This sounds like, and it isn't like. I accept that I'm being anachronistic here, but the question is, what is the relationship between this text and the Thelemic Path or the Golden Dawn program or something? Like, why is it helpful for Thelemites to read this? And so you think about is it the neophyte work where you have to get comfortable in the body of light and be able to go out and explore, do all the path workings on the Tree of Life and be able to get deep into symbols using these, this is about arming yourself with the symbols and being pure without your vestiture, maybe without your mortal
physical
body.
Yeah. I mean, it does smack of, again, coming through a Christian lens, or maybe that's already in the Zoroastrian conceptions as well. It seems like the more I had learned about Zoroastrianism, the more I found that it was like a precursor of Christianity anyway, just in the negation of the flesh and the physical things being, like, it even refers to, I don't think it uses this exact term, but referring to generation in a negative connotation, like the taint of generation and that sort of thing. So meaning, I would say, the idea of procreation and that kind of like physical level of generation being tainted and dirty in the sense of comparison to the more spiritual and rarefied levels and that sort of thing.
You were talking earlier about the relationship between what's going on here and maybe the aspirant and the HGA, First of all, let me say here, lest being baptized to the furies of the earth and to the necessities of nature should you perish. I mean, there's some talk about baptism rituals and stuff in here, and baptisms that are good and bad. So that's included in practice. But all the way down on 192, remember that the HGA working is very protracted, lasting, anywhere from 93 days to 18 months, depending on how you do it. But the final week is 1 week. And during the first half of the week, for the first 3 days, you contact Holy Spirits. And for the next 3 days, you use the power given you by those Holy Spirits to bind a bunch of demons. And then you can use the demons to do magic. So the big climax of the ritual is about 3 days, let's say. 92, for 3 days and no longer need ye sacrifice. So therefore first the priest who governeth the work of fire must sprinkle with water the loud resounding sea. Labor thou around the strophalos of Hecate, and when thou shalt see a terrestrial daemon approaching, cry aloud and sacrifice the stone of Minzurin. If thou, and I tried to look this up, and all of the references to Minzurin come back to the Chaldean Oracles. So, if thou often invokest, thou shalt see all things growing dark, and then when no longer is visible unto thee the high-arched vault of heaven, when the stars have lost their light, and the lamp of the moon is veiled, and the earth abideth not, and around thee darts the lightning flame, and all things appear amid the thunders, from the cavities of the earth leap forth the terrestrial dog-faced demons, showing no true sign unto mortal men. A similar fire flashingly extended through the rushing of air, and a fire of formless, whence cometh the image of a voice, or even the flashing lightning aboundeth, revolving, whirling forth, crying aloud. And also there is a vision of a fatal fire, a counselling light, or also a child, borne aloft on the shoulders of the celestial steed, fiery, or clothed with gold, or naked, or shooting with the bow shafts of light, and standing on the shoulders of the horse. And then, if thy meditation prolongeth itself, thou shalt unite all these symbols into the form of a lion. whence thou shalt behold the holy and formless fire shining flashingly through the depths of the universe, and hear thou the voice of the fire. And so this is a description of 3 days of like sacrifice and meditation and the kinds of images you're supposed to receive, and you go all the way down to meet the dog-faced demons in hell, and all the way up to see, you know, the bowman, the hunter, the Jesus child from Revelation riding on the white horse, you know, that first horseman who is Jesus. And it seems sometimes it seems very much like what's in the vision in the second chapter of the Book of the Law, verse 61 of the Book of the Law, where Nuit is describing, you know, for one kiss wilt thou then be willing to give all. You know, he loses all the light here, and when it's totally dark, there's lightning and things start to come back to him. So it's a meditation ritual and a ritual of sacrifice and regular evocation that sort of gives a spiritual death and resurrection. And it's difficult to know what the practice actually entails, but the feeling is a very Thelemic feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that does bring to mind the idea of like my color's black to the blind, but the blue and gold are seen of the seeing.
Yeah, it's like a ritual of becoming the seeing or something like
and
this.
being rarefied enough to be able to be sensitive to what lies beyond and that sort of thing. Yeah, and to finish that off, we have, when thou shalt behold that holy and formless fire shining flashingly through the depths of the universe, hear thou the voice of fire.
Yeah. Very, very good.
Yeah, so you may stumble across these things from time to time.
Yeah, and it seems like awakening. Maybe because of the darkness, some people might think it feels like crossing the abyss, but it really, to me, it reads like waking up into knowledge and prolonged knowledge and conversation, right? And for 3 days only and no longer must you sacrifice. So this is not something. This is either something you do only once and then don't worry about it anymore, or it's something you do only once and then you retain the divine connection throughout all the days of your life. So you get to keep that HGA experience with you. And
much like the HGA working and also like the Enochian working as well. There's the whole sort of directions to do the work, setting up the table and doing these practices over a set period of time, and then after that, you've created the connection, and then you can maintain it and that sort of thing.
It calls the practitioner a priest, too, right? It says first the priest, before the priest can light the sacred fire, he must sprinkle the raging sea with the water of creation or something like this. And so this is maybe the initiation ritual to where you can then go and then preach on behalf of the fire. So you hear then for the rest of your life the voice of of the fire, and you can go out and become an initiator somehow.
Yeah. Now, I just want to mention, going back, you mentioned the baptism and that sort of thing, and just wanted to mention that's one of those things that comes to mind that would be interesting to look at the original Greek, but it also is just worth sort of keeping in mind that we have a couple of layers of translation, because the term baptism comes from the Greek word, which of course does mean baptizing, but it also means to dip in water and that sort of thing, and to bathe. So subtle things like that. Like, it probably did mean baptize in the context of these Neoplatonic Christians using it, but it could just as easily have meant something like dipping in water in some kind of context like that originally.
Well, it's a specific baptism that you're not supposed to do, and so maybe like, you know, bathing, and maybe it does mean like soak yourself in the pleasures of the earth or something like that. You know, like don't be too obsessed with material pleasures or something.
Which is like, it's a finicky kind of distinguishing, but it's like, and it's not really necessary, so it still means the same thing. However, it's just kind of interesting like that to give an idea of the kind of, you know, nuance that the words and the translations can have and that sort of thing.
Well, it could, lest being baptized unto the Furies of the earth. So the Furies are these Greek goddesses that avenge patricide. If you kill your father, I think if you kill your child, then the Furies kill you. Okay. And that's specifically what they're for. And so you, because they're goddesses, a person reading this casually might think, lest being baptized to the furies of the earth and to the necessities of nature, you should perish. Maybe there's some rival cult that it's saying, don't join this cult, right? But so when you're saying like, it could mean a baptism ritual or it could mean just bathing, it's like,
or dipping in.
It's like, don't. It could be metaphorical reading makes much more sense. Saying,
the term baptism carries so much connotation.
Saying,
to people.
don't soak yourself in the furies of the earth or the necessities of nature. So you're right to point out that that there's a possibility of a euphemistic reading.
And there's throughout this text, that's the same, right? So it's like, I mean, the term baptism carries so much connotation and association for people, and it could just cause a misreading based on the fact that somebody's own personal association with the term. They might not even really know what baptism means, or might not be thinking about it. They just might think, well, it's a Christian, some kind of Christian thing or something like that.
Contemporaneous to this, or at least roughly, the Gospel of Judas, Christ tells only Judas that he's sort of privately laughing at the other disciples, because the other disciples are all performing Eucharistic rituals, and Christ says that's the Eucharistic ritual is to Yaldabaoth, like that's not to our God. The Eucharist is for a demon. Our cult, the cult of the real God, practices the ritual of baptism. And there should be these 5 baptisms. Yeah. But anyway, so sometimes it does mean baptism, like you're saying. But yeah, here it's much better as a euphemism.
Mm-hmm. There is above the celestial lights an incorruptible flame always sparkling, which is exactly the passage I think I was thinking of. So,
good, we got it.
Yeah. The spring of life, the formation of all beings, the original of all things. This flame produceth all things, and nothing perisheth but what it consumeth. It maketh itself known by itself. This fire cannot be contained in any place. It is without body and without matter. It encompasseth the heavens, and there goeth out of it little sparks, which make all the fires of the sun, of the moon, and of the stars. Behold, what I know of God, strive not to know more of him, for that is beyond thy capacity. How wise soever thou art, as to the rest, know that unjust and wicked man cannot hide himself from the presence of God. No subtlety nor excuse can disguise anything from his piercing eyes. All is full of God, and God is in all. It's a very pantheistic conception. And then to finish it off, there is in God an immense profundity of flame. Nevertheless, the heart should not fear to approach this adorable fire, or to be touched by it. It will never be consumed by this sweet fire, whose mild and tranquil heat maketh the binding, the harmony, and the duration of the world. Nothing subsisteth but by this fire, which is God himself. No person begat him. He is without mother. He knoweth all things, and can be taught nothing. He is infallible in his designs, and his name is unspeakable. Behold now what God is. As for us who are his messengers, we are but a little part of God.
That's I'm so glad you read that, because it talks about this central fire being the ultimate authority in the universe. Like, the buck stops with me, right? Mm. And there's nothing to be scared of. Like, I'm the center of the universe, and I'm here to receive you. And it reminds me of something that I've been thinking about all the way along, but maybe haven't said yet, that what's missing from this text is, to me, the essential feature of Gnosticism. Like, there's lots of pre-Christian cults and lots of early non-biblical texts that we can read, and not all of them are necessarily Gnostic. That's not a. But what's missing is this idea of an evil creator. God doesn't necessarily create the world deliberately. He makes a couple of deliberate acts. He says, this Trinity is nice. Let all things be divided into three. And then later he binds mind, soul, and body to make sort of some material being. And God, like the monad, the Father, does both of those things. It seems like, from the fragments that survive, it seems like it's the one God doing both of those creative acts. And those are the bits of creation that happen deliberately. And then everything else is sort of spun off from just raw existence. This is just how fire behaves. Except for if we overinterpret that one passage about Hecate, where it says the fire fills her bosom, that and then radiates out into the created world. If that means that Hecate is really the creator god, like I kind of think it is, then we do have a creator god who's far out from the source of emanation, and it does talk about a second mind, and so there's both a monotheistic picture and a picture within that monotheism of the one supreme deity. There are sort of all these emanations, but there's no like element of betrayal wherein like the bad guy makes creation and it's the wrong thing to do, which to me feels like what makes Gnosticism. So the fact that that's absent from this text is interesting, and makes it really worthwhile that you read that final fragment. Thank you.
Yeah, and just the fact that it does have a really heavy kind of pantheistic connotation to it as well. Makes me wonder if that's, it's kind of interesting to contemplate where that comes from. If it's in the earlier kind of Christian church, this idea of God permeating all things and that sort of thing, or if it's like, because this was translated at a time in the 1700s, maybe, when maybe this translator may have been influenced by ideas from Spinoza, for instance, or any number of possibilities in this respect are kind of interesting for me to contemplate.
I strongly suspect that it's original. I think a lot of Christianity is about the Greek influence on Judaism, and so the idea that, Jesus is Lord and he told us all about this one God thing and stuff. But under that umbrella of creation, there's still this diverse, mythology that exists, and the acknowledgement of other cults, and Jews of many periods, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Like, that's our one God, but other cultures could have also their gods, and that's not inappropriate. It's just inappropriate for Jews.
Ours is the best.
Yeah.
Ours will conquer these.
Ours
other
is the
gods.
best for us, and as long as we obey him, then we're going to be in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
But it's not monotheism until very late is about the belief that of one supreme deity, not necessarily the denial that all other, astral beings exist. You can believe in angels or subservient gods or a son of God or, other heroes.
Like the idea of like God permeating all things was really heavily in Arabic ideas as well. Like Ibn Arabi was a important Arabic thinker on the subject, but yeah, to me it's an interesting point of interest because of the fact that it's just historically exploring the idea as it appears in different places and seeing how it colors the text as it's come to us. But again, the most important thing to us right here and now is just how this feeds into the Golden Dawn and therefore thereby into Thelema. So as you're saying, it's like with the Gnostic considerations, it's not really too heavy on the demiurge aspect of things, which is probably not surprising considering these are Christian Neoplatonists writing about it in a more orthodox context than something like Gnosticism, which would have been heretical at the time. Well, I guess we've we've reached the end. Did you have any other thoughts before we wrap up?
I'm happy that we've covered it. I'm glad we did the second day to finish out the text, and I enjoyed reading it, and I will look forward to revisiting it later in a more fragmented and possibly more academic.
We'll walk in dispersion. Whatever the phrasing was.
Interpretation. Thank you very much, Darren. It's been a blast.
Yeah, thanks for joining me once again. 93.
That is the law of the underworld.
Thanks for listening. Look for Toronto Thelema on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Watch for events in the city. And join us again in the darkly-splendid abodes.
Hey, do you want to do some thelemic virtue signaling and leave the mic on while we do Rush together?
Yeah, let's do that.
So which way are we facing?
This way.
Okay. South. Hail unto thee who art Hathor in thy triumphing, even unto thee who art Hathor in thy beauty, who travellest to the heavens in thy bark at the mid-course of the sun. Tahuti standeth in his splendour at the prow, and Rahur abideth at the helm. Hail unto thee from the abodes of morning. Unity uttermost show, I adore the might of thy breath. Supreme and terrible God, makest the gods in death to tremble before thee. I adore thee. Appear on the throne of Ra, open the ways of the Ku, lighten the ways of the Ka. The ways of the Kabs run through to stir me or still me. The light is mine, its rays consume me. I have made a secret door into the house of Ra and tomb of Kefir the Ra. I am thy Theban anointed, the prophet of the prophets. Thy best now, I rest thy beat. Thy wild stars shall weave my spell. Show thy star splendor of thee. Give me over the miles to dwell over the sea of light beneath. Abide with me, Ra or Queet.